What if I told you that long before Rome crowned itself the undisputed master of the known world, there were African rulers and warriors who stared its legions in the eye and refused to bow? Imagine vast deserts and sun-scorched lands where archers from Nubia rained arrows down on Roman outposts, where generals who had conquered Europe trembled at the sound of distant drums. Picture Carthaginian elephants thundering across snow-covered Alps, their trunks swinging like living battering rams, led by a general who dared to challenge the might of Rome itself. These weren't minor skirmishes or forgotten raids. These were battles that shook the foundation of the empire. Stories of courage, strategy, and audacity that history somehow decided to bury. Queens, kings, and warriors, armed with knowledge of their land, unmatched tactics, and unbreakable will, stood against the most feared army the world had ever seen. And yet, somehow, when you open most history books, you'll barely hear their names. It's as if the memory of their triumphs has been carefully tucked away, hidden in the shadows of marble halls built by their would-be conquerors. But today, that changes. Because in the next half hour, we're diving into untold encounters between Africa and Rome, tales of audacity, intelligence, and raw courage. And yes, one African queen sent Roman generals running for their lives, forcing them to rethink everything they thought they knew about power. By the end of this video, you'll see Rome not as the unchallenged titan you've been taught to admire, but as an empire repeatedly tested and sometimes humbled by legends from Africa. Now, before we dive into the battles, the strategies, and the legends themselves, let's set the stage. This isn't going to be a dry history lesson filled with dates and footnotes. No, this is about moments when Africa wasn't sitting quietly on the sidelines of history, but actively shaping it, challenging empires, and leaving marks that Rome itself could not erase. We'll journey from the thunderous charge of Carthaginian war elephants across the Alps to the sun-baked lands of Nubia, where a one-eyed queen dared to defy Augustus Caesar himself. We'll cross the shifting sands of North Africa, where Berber kings wove guerrilla tactics so clever that Roman generals, trained in the art of siege and conquest, found themselves outsmarted time and time again. These aren't just stories of conflict, they're stories of strategy, ingenuity, and courage. Imagine facing the mightiest army of the ancient world with nothing but your knowledge of the land, your clever tactics, and the unbreakable will of your people. What would you do? Could you stand tall, knowing the fate of your kingdom hangs in the balance? That's exactly what these African legends did, and the results were sometimes astonishing. And that brings us to the question at the heart of today's journey. What happens when Rome, the empire taught to be unstoppable, unconquerable, and supreme, meets African brilliance head-on? The answer is not what most of us were told in school. Sometimes Rome won, but often it learned the hard way that its power was not absolute. African warriors, generals, and rulers were not just resisting, they were reshaping the battlefield, rewriting the rules, and at times forcing the empire to its knees. By the end of this video, you'll see a side of history that has been hidden for far too long. A story of Africa as an active challenger, not a passive observer. A story where the so-called mightiest empire in history met its match in unexpected ways. And most importantly, you'll understand why these encounters matter, not just for history, but for the way we see Africa's role in shaping the world. Let's start with a name that even today sends shivers down the spines of historians: Hannibal. A general from Carthage, a city-state on the northern coast of Africa who dared to do what no one else thought possible. Rome had grown into a colossal power, conquering lands from the Iberian Peninsula to the heart of Italy. But Hannibal decided to take the fight straight to their doorstep. Imagine it,
Winter approaching, snow blanketing the treacherous Alps, and Hannibal's army trudging forward. But this wasn't a small band of soldiers. This was an army that included elephants. Yes, elephants. Towering, unpredictable beasts marching through icy mountain passes, their tusks gleaming, their trunks swaying like living battering rams. Hannibal's plan was audacious, nearly insane, and brilliantly cunning. For Rome, this was more than just a military campaign. It was a nightmare come alive. Generals who had faced the toughest armies of Europe were terrified by the prospect of Carthaginian elephants lumbering down from the mountains, trampling fortifications, scattering troops, and creating chaos in the heart of Italy. For nearly 2 decades, Hannibal haunted Rome's dreams. He didn't just fight Rome, he invaded their imagination, proving that even the mightiest empire had vulnerabilities. And Hannibal's victories were staggering. At the Battle of Trebia, he lured the Roman forces into a deadly trap, using the terrain and cunning maneuvers to wipe out entire legions. At Lake Trasimene, he executed one of the largest ambushes in history, trapping Roman soldiers between hills and water, leaving them with no escape. And then came Cannae, a battle so devastating, so perfectly executed that historians still marvel at his strategy. Hannibal's army, outnumbered and far from home, enveloped the Roman legions in a double pincer, annihilating tens of thousands in a single day. It was the kind of victory that should have ended Rome, but Hannibal never had the reinforcements he needed to march on Rome itself. Still, the psychological impact was enormous. Rome learned to fear a man from Africa. They adjusted strategies, raised new armies, and constantly lived with the knowledge that their empire could be threatened from the south, from a place they thought they had already subdued. Hannibal's brilliance wasn't just in his victories, it was in proving that African ingenuity could challenge the unstoppable. But here's the twist. Hannibal wasn't the only African figure Rome had to worry about. While he terrorized the Italian peninsula, other kingdoms and leaders in Africa were quietly building defenses, forging alliances, and preparing for moments when they too would have their say against Rome. Carthage itself, though ultimately defeated, had set the stage for a pattern that would repeat across the continent. African resistance meeting Roman ambition head-on with courage, strategy, and unexpected outcomes. And this is where our story begins to expand, moving from the snow-covered Alps to the sun-scorched lands of Nubia, where a queen would face Augustus Caesar himself. If you thought Hannibal was remarkable, the battles you're about to hear next will completely reshape the way you see Africa's role in challenging the mightiest empire the world had ever known.
Now, let's leave the snow-covered Alps and journey south to the sun-scorched lands of Nubia, the kingdom of Kush. Stretching along the Nile, Nubia was a land of powerful warriors, rich culture, and kings and queens who ruled with authority and strategy. And among them, one name rises above all others: Queen Amanirenas. Amanirenas wasn't just a ruler, she was a warrior. One-eyed, fierce and determined, she faced one of the most powerful men of the ancient world, Augustus Caesar. Rome had expanded across Europe and the Mediterranean. Its legions were feared, disciplined, and seemingly unstoppable. Yet here was a queen who refused to bend. The story begins with raids along Roman outposts on the Egyptian-Nubian border. Amanirenas sent her archers, trained from childhood, deadly and precise, into battle. They struck swiftly, often disappearing into the sands before the Romans could respond. One of the most shocking moves? Decapitating statues of Augustus that Roman soldiers had erected as symbols of power, leaving clear messages of defiance in their wake. It was a psychological blow as much as a physical one. Nubia would not be intimidated, and Rome had to pay attention.
The battles themselves were a mix of guerrilla tactics and direct engagement. Nubian forces used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, striking with speed and precision before Rome's heavy infantry could fully deploy. They weren't just resisting, they were innovating, showing the world that African kingdoms could wage war on the empire itself and force it to reconsider its ambitions. The outcome? A rare moment of humility for Rome. After sustained conflict, Augustus Caesar agreed to a treaty with Nubia, a peace that acknowledged the kingdom's strength and autonomy. Unlike most of Rome's conquests, this wasn't an outright victory for the empire. Nubia had defended its lands, forced negotiations, and demonstrated that even the emperor himself could not dominate every frontier. But here's what makes this story even more remarkable. Nubia's defiance was not an isolated incident. Across Africa, other kingdoms watched, learned, and prepared. The message was clear. Rome might be powerful, but it was not invincible. And while Amanirenas secured peace for her people, she also set a precedent, showing that African leaders could challenge and negotiate with the mightiest empire of the era. And this is just one chapter of Africa's untold encounters with Rome. Beyond Nubia, in the deserts of North Africa, Berber kings and warriors would continue the struggle, using cunning tactics and bold strategies to frustrate Roman ambitions time and time again. The story of resistance didn't stop with Amanirenas. It was only just beginning.
Let's journey further west, into the rugged deserts and mountains of North Africa, home to the fierce Berber tribes. These weren't just desert nomads. They were warriors, strategists, and leaders who understood their land better than any foreign invader could. And among them, one name stands out: Jugurtha of Nubia. Jugurtha wasn't born into fame, he fought for it. Trained as a soldier, skilled in diplomacy and deception, he rose to power in a kingdom neighboring Rome's territories in North Africa. But what truly made him legendary was the way he waged war against the seemingly unstoppable Roman legions. Unlike conventional armies, Jugurtha relied on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, feigned retreats, and hit-and-run attacks. The Romans, trained for pitched battles on open fields, were bewildered. Imagine Roman generals, armored and disciplined, marching confidently into Numidia, only to be struck unexpectedly by swift Berber cavalry, disappearing into desert winds as if they were ghosts. Entire supply lines were disrupted. Plans meticulously drawn in Rome crumbled under the cunning strategies of one man. For years, Jugurtha humiliated the empire, forcing it to admit that traditional might alone could not guarantee victory. The Roman Senate grew frustrated. Generals came and went, each failing to capture or decisively defeat him. The humiliation reached such heights that it became a scandal in Rome itself. Eventually, the empire had to pour massive resources into his capture, sending reinforcements, gold, and political pressure to finally end the campaign. Yet even in defeat, Jugurtha's reputation endured. He had shown that Africans weren't simply resisting, they were innovators in warfare, thinkers who could adapt, strategize, and exploit the vulnerabilities of the world's most powerful army. Jugurtha's story is a perfect example of a recurring theme in Africa's encounters with Rome. Power is never absolute. Knowledge of the land, intelligence, and adaptability often outweigh sheer numbers. Rome may have conquered territory, but it never conquered the ingenuity of the people who lived there. And just when you think you've seen the full scope of Africa's resistance, there's another story that flips the script entirely. One that doesn't just involve confrontation, but influence. A legend that reveals Africa's role not merely as a battlefield, but as a force shaping Rome itself. It's a story that connects warriors, scholars, and the empire's own survival in ways you wouldn't expect. So far, we've seen Hannibal terrorize Rome across Europe, Amanirenas defy Augustus in Nubia, and Jugurtha outwit Roman generals in Numidia. But these encounters are only part of the picture. Africa wasn't just resisting, it was teaching, influencing, and at times, forcing Rome to adapt. And that brings us to the next chapter:
Africa's indispensable role in the very survival of the Roman Empire.
Up to now, we've seen Africa resist Rome through brilliance, strategy, and sheer courage. But here's the twist. Africa wasn't just a challenger. Rome, the so-called unstoppable empire, depended on Africa in ways most people don't realize. Take Egypt, for example. Its fertile Nile Delta produced grain that fed millions across the empire. Roman armies, cities, and even senators relied on African harvests to sustain their population. Without Egypt's abundance, the empire's stability would have been in jeopardy. Every loaf of bread in Rome, every supply shipped to distant provinces had African soil behind it. And yet, most history books barely pause to mention it. But Africa's influence wasn't limited to resources. Intellectuals from the continent reshaped Roman thought, law, and culture. Thinkers like Tertullian, the fiery theologian from Carthage, Augustine, whose writings would influence centuries of philosophy and Christianity, and Apuleius, whose storytelling still captivates readers today. These were African minds, shaping ideas, beliefs, and literature that became pillars of the Roman world. So when we talk about Rome's power, it's not just the legions, the roads, or the aqueducts. Africa's contribution was vital, embedded in the empire's survival and cultural evolution. In many ways, Africa was the silent partner, the hidden backbone that enabled Rome to function, expand, and endure. Without its grain, resources, and thinkers, Rome wouldn't have been the empire we imagine. And yet, despite this enormous influence, the story is rarely told. Why don't classrooms teach about the intellectual and economic contributions of Africa to Rome? Why are these African figures and achievements largely absent from the mainstream narrative? By looking at these untold encounters, both confrontational and cooperative, we see a new picture of history. Africa was neither passive bystander nor a simple enemy. It was a source of challenge, innovation, and sustenance. It shaped the empire while simultaneously defying it. The story of Rome and Africa is not one-sided. It's a dynamic interplay of power, resistance, and influence that continues to be overlooked. And this brings us to a crucial question. If Africa was so central to Rome's survival, why have so many of its legends, thinkers, and warriors been erased from popular memory? That's the story we'll uncover next, as we explore why these remarkable encounters were hidden and what they tell us about how history is remembered. So, if Africa played such a crucial role, resisting Rome, innovating in warfare, feeding its people, and shaping its culture, why don't we hear these stories in schools, in textbooks, or even in popular media? The answer lies in the way history has been written. For centuries, European narratives dominated the telling of global history. The focus was on empires, kings, and generals who fit a Eurocentric perspective. Stories of African ingenuity, leadership, and resistance were minimized, reframed as minor footnotes, or erased altogether. Conquerors often controlled the narrative, and over time, Africa's role was quietly sidelined, replaced with myths of passivity or subservience. But let's reframe this. These weren't minor footnotes. These were epic encounters, battles and strategies that shook Rome to its core. Hannibal marched elephants across the Alps. Amanirenas forced Augustus Caesar to negotiate peace. Jugurtha outsmarted seasoned Roman generals, and African thinkers reshaped ideas that would influence centuries of philosophy and religion. These were monumental achievements that demand recognition, yet they were written out of the story we've been told. Now, here's a question for you. What if these legends were taught alongside Caesar, Alexander, or Hannibal's campaigns in Europe? What if classrooms celebrated the tactical genius of Jugurtha as much as the victories of Roman generals? What if Queen Amanirenas' courage and strategy were standard lessons in leadership?
The narrative of history and our understanding of power, intelligence, and resilience would look very different. By uncovering these stories, we don't just fill in missing details. We challenge the idea that history belongs to one region, one culture, or one perspective. Africa's legacy isn't hidden because it didn't matter. It's hidden because someone else wanted the story to be theirs. And now, centuries later, we have the chance to reclaim it. These untold encounters remind us that history is bigger, richer, and more complex than we've been taught. They show that courage, innovation, and influence know no borders. And they leave us with one final thought as we wrap up this journey. What does it mean for our understanding of the past when the stories we've been told are only part of the truth?
As we've journeyed through these untold encounters, one truth becomes clear. Africa was never a silent continent in the story of Rome. It was a stage of resistance, innovation, and influence. A place where warriors, queens, and thinkers shaped the course of history in ways that still echo today. Hannibal's elephants thundered across the Alps, haunting Rome for nearly 2 decades. Queen Amanirenas forced Augustus Caesar himself to rethink the limits of imperial power. Jugurtha outwitted Roman generals with brilliance and cunning. And African intellectuals like Tertullian, Augustine, and Apuleius reshaped the very ideas that underpinned Roman culture. These weren't mere footnotes. They were lessons in courage, strategy, and resilience. The key takeaway? Power is never one-sided. Even the mightiest empire can be challenged by ingenuity, determination, and knowledge of the land. African legends didn't just resist Rome. They redefined what it meant to confront, influence, and even survive alongside a superpower. Their stories remind us that true strength comes from vision, courage, and the refusal to be erased from history. And this is just the beginning. There are countless more African legends, leaders, and thinkers whose stories have been overlooked, hidden, or forgotten. That's why we invite you to subscribe to Hidden Kingdoms and Legends. Join us as we uncover more erased chapters, reveal the forgotten heroes, and see history from a perspective that was hidden for far too long. Because when you rediscover these stories, you don't just learn about the past, you gain a new understanding of courage, strategy, and influence that still matters today. The question now is simple. Which African legend will inspire you the most?